All right, welcome everyone. Today's going to be the first day that we dive into front-end development. The main framework that we'll be utilizing for front-end development, the entire cohort, will be React. But before we can dive into what is React and the whole framework and how it works, we need to talk about how it runs and what Node actually does for us as far as creating projects and managing dependencies for us. So that's going to be that's a short overview of what we'll be covering today. We're going to be diving into Node, seeing what Node does for us and how it works, and then afterwards we'll be diving into React. Does anyone have any questions over the topics that we'll be teaching today? Okay, great. So let's start talking about Node. What is Node? I have gotten asked before, like, what does Node stand for? I don't think Node is supposed to necessarily stand for anything. It's not like an acronym for anything. It's just named Node. Someone decided, hey, this is what we're going to name it. We're going to name it Node.js. Now, what Node does is it manages JavaScript projects, and it manages things as a runtime library, meaning that it's able to have multiple JavaScript scripts work together along with HTML documents, maybe some CSS. It's essentially something that can roll up a tremendous amount of JavaScript code and manage which portions of that JavaScript code should be executed and when should they be executed, right? Along with that, it's also able to manage our dependencies with something called a node package manager. Now, we've talked about dependencies before, and we've seen requirements.txt. Actually, we haven't seen requirements.txt, but we've talked about dependencies before, and we've talked about Python virtual environments. And Python virtual environments are important for us because they keep track of our Python dependencies, right? When we're creating our Flask project, excuse me, we had to install things like psycopg. We had to install things such as Flask, Flask SQL Alchemy. Some of us got to install cores to actually be able to create our API and make it public. Well, all those dependencies had to be stored somewhere, right? And they are being stored inside of that virtual environment in that specific Python version that we have. If we dive into a virtual environment, so currently, if I go into, let me see if I have it here. So if I go into default and I then cd into bin and run ls, you can see that I have my activate script, I have pip, and I also have Flask in here. Well, Flask was installed when I did pip install Flask, right? I can also see it in include, I believe. Nope, that ain't it. They all must be inside of that bin folder. So inside of this bin folder, you can see that we have all of our dependencies. I wonder if the Flask is an actual directory. It is not. Let me open this up here. All right, so here we can see Flask being imported, how it works. We have our pip managing a bunch of dependencies, the different types of Python that we're working with. Let's see what else we can populate here. There we go. So inside of lib in Python 13, here is all of the actual dependencies that we've installed. This is what I was trying to show us. I apologize, everyone. It took me a while to find it. But here's Flask. Here's Flask SQL Alchemy. We can see that we have psycopg and psycopg binary, all the different versions of psycopg, more of the packages that go to Flask SQL Alchemy, and it's all being stored inside of that virtual environment. Well, that's great. We understand how it works in Python, and we've seen that before when we talked about virtual environments. But so far, when we create a JavaScript project, what we've been doing is we just create index.html. And after we create index.html, we just make a JavaScript, right? We usually do something like, hey, touch main.js. And then we attach it utilizing a script tag. But what about dependencies? Right? We've utilized fetch to make requests before. But in today's project, we're actually going to utilize another library called Axios. That's not the right Axios. Here we go. We're going to be utilizing Axios to make requests, and we'll be utilizing Axios moving forward to ensure that all of our requests are going through successfully and are being managed better, per se. Well, we're going to see the difference between Axios and fetch here shortly. So let me go ahead and share this resource here in the Yankee Questions channel. All right. And I see a question there from Juan, which I'll be glad to answer here shortly after we finish our lecture. Okay, so now we create main.js, and we can utilize all of the built-in libraries, right? But what if we wanted to use something like Axios, and we wanted to get Axios installed? Well, there's got to be a way to install this into a project, just like we do with pip, right? Pip inside of a virtual environment, we say pip install psychopg3. Well, in this case, you'll notice that we have something called npm. But what is npm, or when is it activated? Let's roll into that. First, we're going to make sure we have npm installed in our local machine. And we're going to do that by doing npm-v. When you run npm-v, it's going to return a version of npm that you have. My version may be a little bit older than the version that you guys have, since I haven't reinstalled npm in a while. But everything should still function the same. So please don't worry if our numbers don't match exactly the same. All right. Well, now that I know I have npm, how do I create an npm project, right? Well, for creating an npm project, all I need to do is run npm init. And you'll see that it brings up a menu of a series of questions. It says, hey, this utility will walk you through creating a package.json file. What is package.json? We haven't talked about that yet. It only covers the most common items and tries to guess sensible defaults. See npm help init for the definitive document on these fields and exactly what they do. So now it says use npm install package afterwards to install packages. Okay, great. That's all good. I'm glad that I get to know that. And then it asks me, hey, what do I want to name my package name? You'll notice that it's adopting the current directory name. So if I wanted to just set it by default, it would name it by the parent directory where this command was executed. All right, so I'm saying, hey, I want to install this n1 intro-npm, and it's going to name the package 1 intro-npm. Now, in this case, I don't want it to do that. So in case I'm going to name, in this case, I'm going to name it Yankee NPM example. It's going to ask me, what version is it? I really don't care about the version. I could add a description if I really would like to. So I'm going to utilize this project to demonstrate fetch versus Axios. It's going to ask me, well, what is the entry point? Well, entry point is something very specific. We'll see what it means. And in this case, we're going to execute main.js. It's going to ask me for a test command. We don't have a test library installed, so we're just going to skip that. It's going to ask for a Git repository. We also don't have that. Keywords, don't need it. Author, if you really want to fill this out, you can. You can name it like Francisco. No license. And then it gives me an example of what my package.json is going to look like. So it tells me, hey, this is going to be a project named Yankee NPM example. It's going to be utilizing the version 1.0 of NPM. Here's the description that you've provided. Our main entry point is going to be main for main.js. The author is Francisco. And currently the license is ISC, which is just the default license. And ask us, hey, is this okay? And I could put yes. And once I run that, you can see that now I have a package.json. All right. Does anyone have any questions over how this package.json was created? All right. If no one has any questions, let's go ahead and do a little bit of execution here. Let's try to run a console.log in this command line here. Let's run console.log and run hello Yankee and see what happens when I run npm main or npm run main.js. So I'm getting an error here. It's saying, hey, it's missing the script. Let me go ahead and just run npm run. Okay, good. So it tells me I run npm run, lifecycle script included Yankee test. So it looks like that tried to execute the test. So let me try to do this. Interesting. I'm running into a little bit of an issue here. I'm gonna have to come back to this portion here in a second and try to debug this. Actually, I'm gonna try to debug it now before we continue on with the lecture because this part's really important. But I don't want to waste your guys' time. Let's go ahead and take an 8-minute break, come back at 9:25, and then we'll continue on with the lecture. Thank you so much, everyone. All right. Well, where we left off was where we built this package.json, and package.json has been built for us when we ran npm init, but we also want package.json to be able to run this main.js script. But how does that happen? How do we start integrating everything? Or how do we even make this into a project? Because so far we created a package.json that doesn't do much for us. We actually have to run npm install once this package.json is created. And when you run npm install, you'll find that a package -lock JSON will be created. And this package -lock JSON, right now it doesn't really have anything. You're going to see this grow pretty much exponentially as you start installing information. But the important thing to remember is package.json is something that you will interact with and manipulate with. Package -lock JSON, you are never going to touch. This is a script that is not to be touched, not to be messed with. It exists there specifically for your machine to be able to communicate to your project, look for dependencies, and have the correct information that it needs to be able to execute each individual script. Package lock JSON is like a map for building package lock JSON. So package.json is just a map. You can interact with this, change the directions. Package-lock JSON, something you never touch. It's just for your project and your machine to communicate with one another. All right. So now that I have that installed, how do I actually get this to execute main.js? Well, in package.json, I can, under the scripts, I can add another command saying, hey, I want you to identify this command as start. And what I want you to do is I want you to run main.js. So now inside of my terminal, I can run npm start. That will go into my project and grab the start script from package.json and execute node main.js, which we can see has console.log Yankee, and we get hello Yankee in the terminal. All right, does anyone have any questions over package.json, package-lock JSON, and how we change package.json to actually be able to execute main.js? Let's hear it, Jacob.
Yeah, I was just following along with you, and when I did npm start, it says missing script start. That's like a small bug or something.
Yeah, so it
Um,
seems like package.json. There's this part named scripts.
oh, okay.
You have to add a start in there.
Gotcha. Gotcha. Thank you.
Of course. All right. Any other questions?
So anytime we, so with Python, we just did Python space in the file. With this one, we have to do npm start in order to run the file.
Yes, in this case, or for this specific project that we just created, we would utilize npm start to run the file. While before, like you mentioned, we would just Python and then the name of the script, right? Which is essentially what we're doing. If I run node and then the name of the script, it still executes it. It's just now I'm utilizing my project to do it, utilizing the start. All right. Well, let's try to take this a step further, all right? Let's try to manage some dependencies. Well, we're familiar with testing libraries now and unit tests, so let's start there. Let's npm install Jest. And you can see that Jest is being installed. It's going to take a little bit of time. All right, so Jest is installed, and we just got a brand new addition to our package.json. We can see that there is a dependencies key now inside of our object. And inside of that dependencies, we have Jest and 29.7.0. Great. Well, let's go into package lock.json. Whoa, package lock.json just took a huge change than what it did before, right? We still have our correct name, but now if we take a look at all the packages, it's taking me through node modules. It's showing me all of these different things. Well, inside of node modules, I have everything that I need to be able to execute Jest, which, as you can see, it is a ridiculous amount of code to be able to execute Jest, right? So as I continue to install packages, those get added to node modules, and those get found or organized depending on package lock JSON. So package lock JSON and node modules are specific between my machine and my project. All I need to worry about, or that I will actually interact with, will be package.json. So I now have a testing suite. And because I have a testing suite, I can specify how I want this test to be executed. I can now, in my test, instead of having echo error no test command found, because all this is doing is showing no test command found, I can run npm test or npm run test. I apologize. And we can see that it just returns no error, no test specified. Well, I can fix that by just switching to the command of Jest. So now if I run test, you'll see that Jest is actually being activated. Right now, Jest is looking for something to test, but because there isn't anything, it's going to tell me, hey, there's no test files here that I can actually test. Here is the information that I was looking for. I was looking for any file, or I was looking for a directory that had underscore test. That directory didn't exist. So then I started looking for a file that had file name plus spec or test.js, but that also didn't exist. All right, let's go ahead and create that. Let's say touch main.test.js. There it is. Now we have main.test.js. We have main.js. And let's just do a quick test here. I apologize. Let me do it this way. And now if I run npm run test, you'll see that it identified one test, but it looks like it didn't like my, oh, this shouldn't be test, this should be expect. There you go. All right, so there you go. It was able to execute my script. It found my test suite. It's all being ran from the package.json. So I ran npm run test. This looks at test, executes the jest command. Jest then found main.test and executed my script. All right, so it's all branching out from package.json and all working within my node package manager. Does anyone have any questions over how we install Jest, the dependencies attribute was added, how it works within the node package manager, and how we were actually able to execute our test suite? Let's hear it, Juan.
So the package.json is just basically helping you organize your program more or less on how you want it to flow. Is that about right?
Yes, and then the other purpose of this is once we push this up to GitHub, right? When you push this up to GitHub, you typically don't push all these node modules because that's a ridiculous amount of code, right? You also wouldn't push package-.json because this gets built from package.json, right? So whenever I'm sharing this project with other people in my team, or I'm sharing this project overall, the only thing that goes up is vital scripts like main.js or the test suite and package.json. So then when they clone it, all they have to run is npm install. And when they run npm install, it goes through this, installs the project, looks at dependencies, and then starts installing all of the different dependencies to be able to run this specific project. That creates node modules and package-lock.json. Right, so think of package.json as the most important file for managing dependencies across different projects. Does that answer your question, Quan?
Yeah, that was perfect. Thank you.
Of course. Jacob?
Yeah, and your main.test.js, I was wondering if you could, I don't know if it's important or not, but what the it is, like the IT, it looks like function. Is that just a function you declared, or I was kind of wondering what that was.
Yeah, definitely. We could go over tests real quick. I think we have enough time to cover that quickly. This should be recap from the test lecture during week 1. Inside of Jest, there's specific commands such as describe, it, and expect. These commands here are utilized. These commands here are utilized to specify what it is that they are testing. So describe usually describes the file that it's texting. So in this case, we would just say main.test.js, ensure it is identified. And then it explains what it is actually testing within the file or what the expectation should be. So it should return true. But describe and it are just built-in functions that exist inside of Jest. Same as expect and to be true.
Okay. All right. Thank you.
Okay, awesome. Any other questions? Okay, fantastic. If there aren't any other questions, let's go into importing from package.let.json. So before we used to utilize this whole require thing to be able to bring in something, but let's go over the fact of working with a JavaScript file. All right, let's go, let's try it out. Let's have a function here. This is just going to be a function that says hello. And this function is going to return a simple hello statement whenever it's executed. Well, inside of main.js, I can now say, hey, I want you to import, say hello from, then I can specify that I want you to import from main.js. Well, now I can write a test here saying, hey, I want you to ensure, say, hello was imported properly. Then we can expect say hello to be hello. All right, so we can run our npm test command here. We can see that one of them passed and one of them failed. And let's see why it failed. So I'm trying to import this say hello from main.js, but it tells me, hey, just encountered a file. When your code, its dependencies use non-standard JavaScript syntax, or when it's not configured out of the box, just supports Babel. All right, it's telling me a bunch of things. Can I use import statements outside a module? So that's the important line here. So we're trying to import a statement outside of a module. Well, what does that mean? And we're going to dive deeper into what a module is and how we can specify a module once we start working with React. But for now, let's do it in package.json real quick. Right under name, or right before name, we're going to add a type module here. And then from there, we'll just run npm install to ensure that that gets installed properly. And now let's run npm run test. All right, well, we continue to get that error, right? Even though we said, hey, we want this to be identified as a module, it's still identifying it as if it weren't a module and throwing an error. So how do we fix that? How does this work in this case? Well, in this case, what we're going to do is we're going to utilize the require attribute. We can say hello is equal to require, and then we can map this to main.js. Right, so now we can see that it's able to actually grab it, or here we see ensure say hello was imported properly. So the issue here is that in main.js, I didn't export it. So I can say module.exports. Oh man, do I remember how to do that one correctly? Let's see. I believe you can do it this way. Let me take a look at that real quick. Okay, module.exports. Got it. Not a function, but it wants a dictionary. So let's do module.exports. Instead of a function, this would be a dictionary. And what I wanted to export is say hello. There you go. Let's try that out. There it is. Fantastic. A little bit of Google help, but that's okay. All right, we were able to export the say hello function because we weren't able to identify this as a module. And then we were able to go ahead and in main.test, grab it utilizing the require attribute, and then run expect to be able to test our code. Great. So now that we have all our information, let's go into taking our code a little bit further. We talked about exporting and importing, but what about things like Axios, right? This isn't something that's built in. This is something that I want to install into my project and utilize within main.js. So how do I do that? Well, I'm going to npm install Axios. That's going to install Axios for us. We'll be interacting with the Pokey API yet again today. I know it's getting old, but it's a good API. I really like it, and I promise we will all become fans of it here shortly. And in this case, what I want to do is I actually want to utilize Axios. So I ran npm install Axios. If I go into package.json and I come down to dependencies, we see that Axios is now installed. If I go to package-lock.json, and I'm just going to use command F here because otherwise we'll be looking forever. you can see that now inside of node modules, there is an Axios directory. And in there, we can find everything that we need to be able to execute Axios. Great. So now I have Axios installed in my project. How do I use it inside of my function or inside of my code? What I'm going to do is I'm going to run import Axios from Axios. And then I'm just going to create a function here. It's named get Pokemon. Let's not do asynchronous for now. Let's run a regular one. I'm just going to say, hey, I want to have Axios run a get request to the following URL. And I just want to take in the response. I want to console.log response so I can see what it looks like. All right, and let's execute this get Pokemon function. I'm going to go ahead and run npm run start. It was not defined. Oh, let me comment this out. Well, okay. I console.log this response here, and you can see that the console.log of that response is already my entire Pokemon dictionary, right? If I scroll all the way to the bottom, here's all of the sprites and weight and all of the information that we wanted earlier that we have to run through different .jsons and all these other things inside of fetch. Well, when I utilize Axios, it actually brings everything back already in JSON format inside of this .data attribute. So when I run npm response inside of response.data, or when I run npm run start inside of response.data, I can see all of the information regarding this Pokemon. So I could just say response.data.sprites.front default. I execute my script, and that returns the actual Pokemon that we're looking for, the good old Ditto. So that's a lot less lines of code than what we had before. Let's take a look at the other function that we had. So get Pokemon fetch. Again, we're not going to utilize async. We're going to keep it simple and utilize fetch here. Notice that in fetch, it is assuming that I'm running the .get method. But if I wanted to do something different, I would have to specify, hey, the method that I'm going to use is going to be post or put or all these other things, right? I would have to specify those off the bat. Whereas in Axios, I just utilize dot and I can throw whatever verb I want after that. I could run put, post, or delete by just dot and then put, post, or delete, right? Well, here, I would take .den, grab the response, and let's console.log this response. We'll call both of our functions. So now when we call both of our functions, one of them is returning all of these headers, which is our fetch here. It's returning all of these headers. It's mainly concentrating on the response itself, but it's not giving us any of the data. Whereas Axios, as soon as it was executed, it gave us back exactly what we're looking for, right? With all of our data already completed, been already a JSON format, and for us to be able to manipulate right away. In our fetch response, we still would have had to say, well, now I want to return response.json. And then we would have had to add another one saying .den, which grabs the data And then this function would then console.log data dot front default dot sprites, where I got those mixed up. Now, when I run it, both of them return the same information, but look at the amount of code that I had to write for both of them. In fetch, I had to grab the data. Well, first I had to grab the response. I then had to iterate through the response and turn the data into something JSON readable. And then I could finally iterate through the data. Where when I utilize Axios, Axios sends the request. It knows that I want the data specifically. And if I didn't just want the data and I wanted that first response, I can also go something into response.headers. And that would return the first argument that gets returned by fetch. It gives me access to everything right off the bat, whereas in fetch brings it back in segments. Right, so Axios is going to be our preferred method to send requests moving forward, because one, we can specify the HTTP method. It has a lot of assumed headers that will work with the majority of APIs without requiring us to specifically specify them within the headers. And also the way it returns the response is pretty much all in one. It returns the headers, the body, the data, all of it right away. Whereas fetch doesn't. Fetch returns a response, and then you could manipulate that response to grab the data out of it. So there's the key difference between fetch and Axios. Does anyone have any questions over how to utilize fetch and how to utilize Axios? Let's hear it, Juan.
For Axios, does it have a built-in catch method, or do we have to specify kind of just how the fetch method we have to do .catch?
Yeah, that's a great question. We definitely still have to specify. We can say .catch and then grab an error and console.log set error. Does that answer your question, Juan?
Yes, thank you.
Could you run through how to actually get that main.js to run again?
Yes, definitely. In order to get main.js to run, we take a look at our package.json. In package.json, we can see we have our scripts. So these are the executable commands that we can have inside of NPM. And currently we have two commands. We have test and we have start. Start runs node main.js. So in my terminal, I tap NPM run start. And that runs my main.js script. All right, so here it tells me, hey, we're inside of the project of Yankee NPM example. The command that we are executing is start. And then it says, hey, this is the command that I'm executing. It's node main.js. So it goes into main.js and executes the script. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, thank you.
All right, any other questions? Okay, perfect. If there aren't any other questions, I'm going to go ahead and pause our recording for now. All right, in this portion of our lecture, we're going to be talking about Vite to be able to create our project. So what we just saw earlier was us creating a Vite project out of from scratch, right? Something that we haven't necessarily done before. We went into creating a project by just doing npm init and doing the very minimum for creating an npm project. But now we're going to dive into Vite. Now, this part in Vite is very important, and it goes into why Vite, like why would you even want to utilize something like Vite? Vite is a new framework, I want to call it. It's not necessarily, it is a framework. And what it does is it essentially provides us a way to avoid all of the extra steps that we used to have to do back in the day in order to be able to create a JavaScript project, like a React project. We would have to go into something like a rollup. We used to have something like a bundler. We used to have to implement a pretty extensive framework from scratch almost every time. As soon as you made a project, you had to go through a list of steps to get everything set up in order for React to compile correctly, to get a development server that's working correctly. But all of that really taxed the system, not only in the developer. In order to start a new project, it took, a considerable amount of time, but it also would slow down server starts, right? And it goes into talking about dependency tracking and why V is so fantastic. Well, V essentially has all of this stuff already integrated inside of it. And when you go into creating a React project, rather than doing everything step by step from scratch, V offers a way for us to be able to do it with one simple command, and it creates the entire framework for us. So with that said, let's dive into how we can create a Vite React application. And actually, before we go into that, there's one more thing that I want to show. Vite does not only support React, it also, if you want to just do something in vanilla JavaScript, you can do it in vanilla JavaScript. We have React TypeScript and React. It has a considerable amount of frameworks that you can utilize if you want to just create different applications with different languages, which I strongly recommend later on. If you want to come back and do this in Vue, or I know Svelte is getting really popular nowadays as well. Other than React, those are definitely good frameworks or languages that you might want to pick up for front-end development. All right, so now let's actually go into Vite. How does this work? Well, what I can do is I can run npm create Vite. Notice I never installed Vite, so how does it know to do this? Well, npm goes into this. Actually, for some of you who run this for the first time, it may ask you to install Vite. But this npm create Vite should work for all of us. Once we run this command, it's going to ask me, hey, what do you want to name this project? And in this case, I'm just going to name it example Vite. It's going to ask me, well, what framework do you want to utilize to create this project? And look at that. We have React, Preact, Lit, Svelte, Solid, all these other things. You could go into others. It's just giving you the most popular ones. In this case, we're going to go with React. It's going to ask me, well, what language do you want to utilize? Do you want to utilize TypeScript? This SWC just gives you a little bit more power as far as being able to define specific packages or how you want things to compile. We're not going to utilize the SWC. We're just going to stick with regular, good old JavaScript for this example. And then it gives me step-by-step directions on how to work with my project. Well, before we go into that, let's start diving into what just happened. So this one single command, npm create Vite, ended up creating this entire project structure. I have this thing called public, which is just holding an SVG, which is just the Vite icon. I have a directory named source, which we'll dive deeper into that here shortly. I have this ESLint, which I'm never going to touch unless I absolutely need to. And to be yeah, just don't interact with this ESLint for now. There's a .get ignored that gets automatically populated for us. Well, that's fantastic, right? Now I don't have to worry about myself blocking things from being able to go up to GitHub. It's doing it for me and saying, hey, you typically don't want any of these things going into GitHub, so we're just going to create this file for you. And then we have an index HTML that's going to show up on the browser once I run my development server. And we have package.json with the name of example Vite, all of it being created for us. Here it's giving me a type module. I have a couple of scripts that have already been interacted for us. We have Vite, Vite build. We have something for ESLint to be able to run. And then we have something like preview and two dependencies. We have the React document object model and we have React. And a couple of other dev dependencies there, all already installed for us. We have this Vite config, which we will interact with later on in the program. This will essentially tell the entire project where it is that we want to compile it, but we'll go into that later on. And then it gives us a master README where we can just describe our project, anything that goes on. All right, so running the Vite or npm init in the separate project gave me package.json, but they didn't give me this entire project structure. Well, Vite knows that because I want to run a React project, this is what I want my project to look like. So it essentially already has a template somewhere in GitHub. And when I run this command to start this project, it says, well, this is the template we're going to download. And it grabs it, copies it down into VS Code for me, right? Inside of this source, inside of the source directory, I have assets, which is just another SVG or where I can put pictures that I can attach to my different code. We can see I have app.css, which already has some CSS inside of it. I have app.jsx, which currently we're not going to talk about this today, but these are called hooks. We'll see hooks later on, and by later on, I'm talking about tomorrow. But then we can see that our JavaScript file is actually returning HTML now. Interesting. I wonder how that works. In index CSS, we have more CSS that's being applied here. And then finally, we have a main.jsx with one specific function here, and it's telling to render a app. All right, we're going to decipher all of this and how this works here shortly. But I just wanted to give a quick overview of the project structure. All right. So there it is. We were able to create our Vite application. We can also do something like creating a Vite application inside of the directory. When you could either create a project with the command that I used, or you can put a period at the very end of that command. So let me go ahead and put that here in Yankee questions. You can do npm create Vite and then put a period at the very end. And by putting that period, instead of putting it inside of a nested directory, it's just going to put it all on the outside. So let's take a look at what that looks like. I'm going to delete my example. I'm going to run npm create Vite. I'm going to put a period at the very end. It's not going to ask me for the project name. So it says there's a current not empty directory, remove existing files and continue. No. So it cancels the operation. If I wanted to remove this, then it would work. Because I don't want to remove that, let's go ahead and create a directory. So McDeer, let's do example. Oh, hello. We'll change directory into example Vite. You'll see it's an empty directory. There's nothing in there. Now I can run npm create Vite period. All right, it goes into asking me the framework and then ask me the name this time. I choose React, I choose JavaScript, and you can see that it creates it all within the directory that I called the command. All right, so npm create Vite without a period will create a directory where your project is going to live. npm create Vite with a period will create the project within the directory where this command was executed. So there's the two differences, right? One puts it in a nested directory, the other does not. All right, so now we have our Vite example. Let's follow these instructions. It's telling me to run npm install. So let's run that. Now it's going to install everything in the dependencies within package.json. And you can see now I have this node modules that was populated. Right, node modules has all the code I need to be able to actually execute my project. And now package.json was created as well. Okay, so we know package.json gets created from package.json. And then utilizing package.json, we grab all of the different code dependencies that we need to install in order to execute the JavaScript code. So that everything's existing within node modules. Great. So now I have all this information. I have all my setup, all of my dependencies. Let's run our last step. Let's run npm. Oh, hello. There we go. npm run dev. And now we have this local host being occupied. We've seen this before with Flask, where a server is essentially being occupied. We've also seen it with Go Live whenever we try to utilize live server, right? Inside of my local machine, there is a port that is now being occupied to render all of the information of index.html. All right, so let's take a look at what index.html has to offer. So index.html is showing me these two SVGs. One of them has a pretty nice animation. I have this counter button that I can click on and things are being updated. If I refresh the site, it goes back to 0. But it's just essentially a general template with some CSS, right? Well, if we take a look at index.html, index.html doesn't have any of this. So how is all of this being created? Does anyone have any ideas where all of this content could be being created and populated?
Maybe in
Is it
the
coming
JSX.
JSON? The JSON file?
Maybe a JSON file? Okay, Jacob?
I'm just guessing, but maybe the JSX file.
A JSX file, are you talking about line 11?
Oh, yeah, never mind. Yeah,
Oh.
that's what I was just guessing. So
No, I mean, you're actually right. If you were guessing, this is exactly where this code is coming from.
oh,
Right.
okay, cool. Then I was
So
right.
it starts from top, starts reading down our icon and starts updating everything inside of our tab, and it lets the browser know, hey, this is going to be HTML that you're going to be receiving. Then it goes into the body and there's this div root, but it's empty, right? There's nothing in there. But if we go into the script here, it says, hey, we do have a JavaScript script that we want you to read. And this is called source main.jsx. So if we open up our source and we go into main.jsx, well, inside of main.jsx, what we have is we have a, hey, there is a React DOM. I want you to create a root. And then we have this document.getElementById root. Well, document.getElementById root is referencing to the division on line 10. Right, so it's saying inside of this division in line 10, I want you to render. So render is usually something like, hey, insert HTML in here. And what the HTML that I want you to render, React strict mode is something that we'll talk about tomorrow. But essentially it's just a parent that ensures that things are being rendered correctly. But what I would want you to render is app. Okay, great. Well, where's app coming from?
App.jsx.
Nice. So if we take a look at line 3, we can say, hey, I want you to import app from app.jsx. Okay, so we have an HTML document that renders. So we have an HTML document that renders. Great. After that HTML document renders, we have a division named root. And inside of that division named root, we are using main.jsx to render app.jsx. All right. That is all that is happening up to this point, which is quite a bit, right? So HTML renders on the browser, root renders on the browser. Then we see this script tag that goes to main.jsx, and main.jsx says, hey, I want you to grab the app and render this. Well, all right, let's see what app is actually doing. Well, here we can see an export default where we're exporting the function of app. And at the very top, we can see the function app. So this is what's being exported, what gets imported in main.jsx and gets rendered. All right, well, let's take a look at this app function. What does it do? This app function has a const, which has a variable and a function. And we'll deep dive into hooks later on. And then in our return statement, what we're returning is HTML. And this HTML is what shows up on our screen here for V. Well, let's test that theory. All right, let's make sure that we're right. Let's go ahead and add an H1 element and say, hello, Yankee. And now you can see that hello, Yankee is being displayed on my browser. All right, does anyone have any questions regarding the V project structure? How do we create the V project and how V actually renders in our browser? All right, let's hear it, Quan.
Why is there an empty tag over in line 10?
Line 10, empty tag. These are called fragment tags. And we're going to be diving deeper into what fragment tags actually do. Essentially, in React, whenever you have a return statement, that return statement should always return HTML. And sometimes you want multiple components inside of this return statement, right? Or multiple division tags, multiple elements, without them being nested. Well, this only returns one HTML element. So it used to ask you to wrap it all inside of a parent division tag. But because that became, developers consistently said, hey, like this is ineffective. We can't work doing this. We need a way to be able to have multiple elements without creating a parent division tag. They created the fragmentation tag, where it's essentially a way for JavaScript to group all of your HTML code inside of one element without actually creating a division. Does that answer your question, Juan?
Yes, thank you.
Awesome. Demi?
Yeah, so why do the app.jsx if you already have a main.jsx? Like, couldn't you just put that function in the main JSX? What's the need for this app file?
Yeah, that's a great question. So that goes more into the project structure and like isolation of information. Your project is going to grow and you're going to have multiple scripts. Some of them may be pages, which are entire documents or entire web pages. Some of them may be elements, which are just repeated lines of code or design that you want to show up for an image over and over again, right? So with that said, you need a place to essentially gather up all of that information. So main.jsx is essentially the last entry point before it actually gets injected into HTML. And app.jsx is, hey, this is where I want all of my code to come together and compile together, or like all of the dots to be connected before I actually start the HTML insertion. Does that answer your question, Denny?
Yeah, so you would just update that main.jsx instead of apps, you had something else and you would insert it there. That way it talks to the index or the index.html.
Right. So main is for speaking to index HTML. App is for connecting the dots between all of your scripts.
Got you. Okay, thank you.
Awesome. And I could have swore I saw another hand up.
Yeah, I had the same question as Demi.
Oh, okay. Fantastic. Any other questions? All right. If there are no questions, then let's go ahead and start diving into how we would actually write some code inside of a JSX file, right? For today, we're just going to stick to app.jsx, and we're not necessarily going to use any of our React hooks, either for today's assignment or for any of the exercises that's required of you today. Don't try to implement some of the React hooks. Stick to the vanilla HTML and JavaScript functions that we've learned so far, just to get familiarized with the React framework before we start opening up the Pandora's box of React. So with that said, what we're going to do is we're going to utilize Axios to make a request to the Poke API and render a Pokemon depending on user input, right? So we want to capture user input, and let me actually pseudocode this here so that we all have the instructions. So capture user input for desired Pokemon name or ID. Make request for front sprite from Poke API. Render image for user. And reset input field to blank. So there's everything we want to do. All right. So let's start with the very first portion here of capture user input. How would I capture a user's input? And let me go ahead and empty out all of this CSS that's been provided for us. All right, and boom, there you go. All right, how would I go about accomplishing this task? I want to capture user input for a desired Pokemon, either name or ID. I want to then make a request to the Poke API to grab one Pokemon, and then I want to render an image. Let's just imagine we're within regular JavaScript and HTML. How do I capture user input?
You could grab whatever the value is entered in some sort of text box.
Okay, so we would want an input field and you type text. This input field would have a placeholder of Pokemon name, and then we would close it. All right, so there's our input field. What's next? Will that be enough to capture the user input, or do we want to add a button for them to submit this information? Do we want to turn this into a form? What's next?
I was gonna ask if you want to do a form with on submit and then make a input submit button.
All right, let's do that. All right, so there's a form, and then let's do an input type submit. Okay, and then you mentioned an on submit function. Now, notice this on submit is a little bit different than our regular HTML, right? Before it was all in lowercase letters. Well, now it's following more of our JavaScript conventions, where we have on in lowercase, and then because we're starting a second word, we're utilizing camel casing to symbolize, hey, this is where the submit function is going to go. And for now, let's just do a function called handle submit. And let's make this function something like this. Let's just say console.log form submitted. And finally, let's call it handle submit. Okay, there's a couple of things that I need to do for this function to work properly. What would be the next step here? I have a function. I am triggering an event of submitting a form, and then I'm console logging form submitted.
You have to get your input, your submit input to trigger handle submit.
All right, so I want to trigger handle submit. So you're saying that once I submit this form, I got to capture the input. Is that what you're saying?
Yes.
Okay, awesome. So how would I do that?
Would you add the parentheses after the handle submit and put event in there?
Okay, awesome. Let's go and grab the event. Notice how I did that as well. I am now calling a function that is passing in the event into handle submit. All right. And because we know that every time I submit a form, it's refreshing the browser or doing a automatic reload, what else do I need to do to prevent that from happening?
prevent default.
Awesome. Let's go ahead and add that. Event dot prevent default. All right, so now we're preventing the default. We have the event. Interesting. Okay. How do I think, Owen, you mentioned that I would want to now capture the information that's inside of that form with this input field. How would I do that?
You would have well, you'd have to put an ID on whatever your form is. Or so like on your input, your text form or input, I mean, put an ID there.
Okay, and let's just do user input.
And then in your handle submit, you'd get document dot get element by ID. And then put your ID in there, user input. And then dot value, I believe.
Value. Let's console.log this stuff. All right, let's see what we have so far. Gonna go ahead and inspect. Move this down. Go into the console. All right, I'm gonna refresh my page. Nothing really other than showing me that V is connected. Put hello. And when I press enter, well, we can see a form was submitted and hello is being logged into the console. So this is working so far. Let's hear it, Juan.
All right, this is more like a sidebar. I'm just curious. Is there ever a time we would actually let or where we would not use prevent default? Because it's kind of strange that we always have to kind of stop the default from going off.
Yes, there is. So in this case, we are stopping it because we're focusing on creating a single page application, right? Where essentially all of our information is happening within one HTML document. But if you were working in a page or an application that was not a single page application, and it was actually sending information over to the server for specific pages or specific parts of the website needed specific information, and it was rendering an entirely different template and not just one page, then you would actually want to have different actions for that submit method. Does that answer your question, Quan?
Yes, thank you.
Of course. All right. So everything's we captured our user's input. We were able to type it in. And actually, I'm just going to put this as input there. And instead, I'm going to do let user input be equal to input dot value. That way I have the HTML tag itself, and then I could have the value as well. Okay, great. So it looks like we've accomplished part one. We were able to create a user input for desired Pokemon name or ID. I can grab an ID as well. I could put in numbers. Okay, and now we have the second part of make a request from the Poke API. Okay, how do I do that?
You'd want to do a Ajax fetch request.
Okay, so we're gonna do const, and let's say get Pokemon image. Let's make that, we're gonna utilize async for this example. And you're gonna say let response be equal to fetch. And we're just gonna take in this Pokemon like this. Let me come over to the Poke API, grab their URL, and exchange this ditto by Poke. Okay, great. So I grab the Pokemon input, I make my fetch request, and I forgot to add an await here. Okay, so what happens when that information comes back? What's the next step?
You utilize the dot then and then grab that response information and then turn it into a JSON file.
All right, so we grab the response and turn it into something JSON readable. Okay. And now we just return the sprite, right? So
Yeah, which is dot sprite dot default, I think.
data dot sprites dot front default. All right, awesome. So there you go. We have all of our information. We have our get Pokemon function ready to go. All we need to do is pass in the attribute. So how do I do that inside of the handle submit?
You could set the poke equal to the value, whatever the value is, the user's input value.
All right, awesome. So I can say let image URL be equal to get Pokemon image and pass in the user input. All right. Okay, great. Now, because I am calling an asynchronous function in here, that's going to turn my handle submit into an async function now because I have to await for the response. Well, let's console.log this response. I'm going to go ahead and send this utilizing, let's go with Ditto just to make sure that it works. Okay, I send it and it does in fact return Ditto's image. So far everything is working, right? We created a function that was able to make a request to the Poke API and grab the image. So we capture the input field, we grab its value, we pass it into our function. Our function sends a request utilizing fetch. It grabs that response and turns it into JSON readable, returns the image URL, which gets saved in this variable of image URL, and we log it into the console. Fantastic. Everything's coming together pretty well so far. Now let's go into our third step. We will have to render an image for the user. How would I go about doing that?
You'd want to use like insert an image tag whenever like the submit button, I think, is pressed. So maybe a new function.
Right, so we have a function named create image that takes in a URL. And Haley, could you walk me through creating this function?
Would it just be the same as we're not doing an event listener this time, no?
No, we're just gonna create an image and we want that image to show up inside of the HTML document here.
Okay. Couldn't you just do let image equals would you still use that URL, the HTTPS?
Yeah, so we're gonna pass in the URL into the function. So eventually we would want to do something
Okay.
image dot source be equal to URL. But how do I create that image first?
Not quite sure. I'm gonna be
Okay.
honest.
Awesome. Let's pass it off then. Let me see. Brian, could you help me out with being able to create an image element?
Yeah, would you have to create the image container first?
All right, let's go ahead and do that. Let's go here and add an image container. Let's do a division, and we're just gonna give this a ID and call this image container. Okay, so now we have an image container. Awesome.
Yeah, so then we're back up in there, and it would just be, you just do for the image, you document dot create element of image tag type.
All right, dot create element of the image tag. We already passed in the URL into that image source. Great.
Yep.
Fantastic.
And then you would just set the like parameters you would want for the size of it, width, height, border.
All right, let's do that. Dot style, dot height equal to, and let's do 30 min here. Width. And then finally, let's do border. Let's make that equal to solid 1 pixel. All right. Awesome. So there's our entire image being created. All of the styling that we want is there, and we're passing in the URL to the image source. What's next?
You would have to append the child URL to the image container.
Perfect. So then we could say document dot get element by ID. This one would be image container dot append child, and we could pass in the image. Okay, great. So now we have our create image tag there. Our function has been created for being able to create an image. How do I plug it in into my handle submit? What's next? What's the last step? Let me go ahead and pass this one off to Jesus.
Do you just call it, return it within the handle submit, the create image function?
Nice. So instead of console.log, I want to create image. Okay, great. Let's try it out. Let's see. I put in ditto. I click submit. Ditto works. Great. Let's have Charizard. Charizard works. Let's do the classical Pikachu. Pikachu populates. Okay, great. So all of our Pokemon are being rendered on the screen. We were able to do this. We prevented the default behavior of the form, meaning it's not refreshing and sending that request every time. I'm handling that request myself. We capture the input field, which is just a division. From there, we grab the value of that input field to pass it into the get Pokemon image. This then sends a fetch request to the Poke API with the correct input. That response comes back. We then turn that into readable data utilizing response.json, and we return the data.sprites.front default. That gets saved into image URL, which then gets fed into the create image function. The create image function creates an image tag. We set the image source to the URL from the Poke API. We add some styling, which is just height, width, and a border. And then we append this image to the image container. And the image container is an empty division in line 42. Awesome. Owen?
Yeah, I'm having trouble getting my server to pull up. Is there a specific, do you have to go into like the source directory in order to run it? And then what's the command to run it? I know
So
that's a little off topic, but
one is if you started your project and if you run ls, you could see your project. You want to change directory into your project.
okay.
You want to run npm install. That will install all your dependencies. And once that is done, you will run npm run dev. And that will run your server.
Okay, thank you.
Absolutely. All right. Now, in case we ever want to look for commands or don't know when commands should be executed, we could always go inside of our scripts. And in scripts, we can see we have the dev, build, lint, and preview command. So npm run dev will run our development server. All right. Any other questions? Let's hear it, Tristan.
For that, just so I could wrap my head around it, the prevent default, is that just preventing like the whole page from refreshing, or is that just preventing that text box from canceling itself out
It's
from that function?
preventing the whole page from refreshing.
Okay.
Page is actually being re-rendered whenever you submit a form, unless you have this event.prevent default.
Okay.
Awesome. All right, it doesn't seem like we have any other questions, so let's go into the final part here. Once the page, or once we render that image, we want to reset the input field back to blank. How could I do that, Sam?
Sorry, I'm still trying to catch up. I think someone else should answer.
All right, let's go ahead and pass it off then. James?
Which one?
James Cromer. Perfect.
All right. That's what I get. Can you say the question again? Sorry.
Yeah, so now that we've created all this image, the final step that we have is just resetting the input field back to being blank, meaning having no input. Right now, when I do ditto and I submit, ditto is still in my submit bar or inside of my input field. So how do I get rid of that ditto? How do I make it go back to blank?
In the, we need to add something in the handle submit at the end of it, I think.
All right.
Is that
Awesome.
where we would add like a, I don't know what we would add exactly, but like some sort of clear.
Yeah. So
yeah. So,
we have the input field here, right? So we could grab the input field. And just like we grab dot value, we could also assign dot value. So we can say input dot value is an empty quotations. So we refresh our page, search for ditto, and it goes back to empty. Awesome. Thank you, James. All right, everyone. So that's utilizing fetch. Let's start going over our code here. All right. We were able to create user input or capture the user input for a desired Pokemon ID. We do that within the handle submit. We grab this user input by get value by or get element by ID. We then grab that value and we were able to capture it. Great. We then made a request from the Poke API. So get Pokemon sends a asynchronous request to the Poke API. We'll wait for that response. We then turn that response into data and we return that image sprite. Great. We then render an image for the user. So we created this create image function, which creates an image tag. We add the URL. We add all of the styling, and then we send that into the image container. And then finally, we reset the input field back down in the handle submit, where we say input.value is back to an empty value. All right, let's hear it, Juan.
Sorry, we did the styling in the image tag that we created, but is there a way, I'm pretty sure we're probably going to get to this later, to add the styling beforehand in like app.css? Or is that not for new items that are created during the web page? We should probably do them in the JSX file.
Yeah, it's a great question. So if you wanted to do something like, hey, I know that I'm going to be creating Pokemon images, so I can make a Pokemon image class, right? And inside of this Pokemon image class, Well, I know that I want the height to be 30 v min. I want the width to be 30 v min. And I want the border to be, let's just say 2 pixels. Black, solid. And let's even add a border radius here. And let's make that 5 v min. Add a background color of this reddish brown that it has, right? So there's all the CSS that I want to have inside of this Pokemon image when it gets created. Well, instead of adding it this way, I can always say, hey, I want image.className. And I can make that equal to Pokemon image. Right. Yep. So that's what I named it. Now notice that in React classes, instead of just specifying class space and naming a class, it's class name. And that's because, you know, JavaScript is a programming language. If you utilize class, class is a reserved word. So in order to prevent them from fighting against each other, they just change the class convention for HTML to be class name. So if I want to give something a class, it will always be class name. A class. All right. So now when I go into creating something, so I go into creating Ditto, Ditto populates with all that CSS already being rendered into it. Oh. All right, so there's Ditto and Charizard. Does that answer your question, Juan?
Yeah, the only thing is, would we ever really want to use them inside of JSX? Like maybe like one-off instances, or if we know we're gonna have the potential to create these, should we always just to have cleaner code, put it in the .css file?
I would always put it in the .css file. I would keep your styling isolated to .css files and your dynamic behavior isolated to JavaScript files. All right, James Byers.
Yes, can you refresh my memory real quick on line 13 where the IMG and quotation marks came from?
IMG in quotation marks, absolutely. So this document.create element will create HTML tags. This is the equivalent of me creating something like IMG src equals pound. Right? It's just that instead of doing it within HTML, I'm doing it inside of JavaScript. Does that answer your question, James?
Yes, okay, I'm tracking. I created that tag, that element. Got it, thank you.
Of course, awesome. All right, this is great. So now we have all this information, everything has been clicking together. We got our functions that are doing what they're supposed to do. And we were able to follow kind of our roadmap here, right? Or pseudocode of the different functions that we wanted to implement. There is one last thing that I would like to add here. So currently I'm utilizing this handle submit button, which is working with async and await. But the one thing that I don't like is that we're still utilizing fetch. How could I update this project first so that Axios is within my project, and then update this function to utilize Axios to grab my data?
You could go to the top of the page and from Axios, import Axios.
All right, let's import Axios. Oh, well, that's throwing me an error. It's saying that Axios doesn't exist yet. Let's try to do from the space here. Yeah, Axios doesn't exist yet. Maybe there's something I got to do at the project level first.
You'd have to npm install it. I
Perfect.
forgot that step.
So I run npm install Axios. Now we can see that Axios is being installed into this example. I'm going to go back into running the development server now. And now I can say, hey, I want to import Axios from Axios. And Axios actually exists within my project, and it was able to import it successfully. Great. So now I have Axios available to me. Now let's update this function. how do I change it from utilizing fetch to utilizing Axios?
Would we do like the try catch thing or whatever?
We could, yeah, we could definitely throw a try and catch here. So we can do try. And let's do a catch. And
And
console.error, error, and then return.
and then I think it was like it's like Axios dot something. I think it's like another way to like the in the try statement like uh I don't remember what it's called. It's like Axios dot something.
Ah, I see. So you're saying to call Axios and call the get function. I'm sorry, this is throwing an error, and I'm not sure why this is throwing an error. Catch. I don't believe I'm making a mistake there. But for some reason, it's saying that I am. Let's see.
Parentheses, maybe? I don't know.
Oh, you know what? You're not wrong. Thank you for saying that. There you go. All right. Yeah, small little syntax parentheses. Thank you. All right, so we want to call Axios, right? So maybe instead of response await fetch, what we want here is we want something like, hey, I want my response to be await Axios dot get because I'm sending a get request. All right, so Axios sends that get request. We know we no longer need this response.json because it returns it in all in one. So what would variable data be now?
Would it just be the data dot sprites? Like
Close.
it's like the return? Okay. Maybe.
Yeah, so the return is data.sprites, right? But
Yeah.
earlier I had to turn it into response.json, but I don't need that anymore because the data is within the response. So how could I grab it out of the response? Let's hear it, Gary.
Would it just be response.data?
Perfect. So I can say response.data. All right, and now we send ditto, and ditto comes back. We can send Charizard, and Charizard comes back. Awesome. So now we've updated our project to utilize Axios to send our request, grab information, and bring it back. All right. Let's go ahead and do a quick overview over the entire application and how it functions. And then afterwards, we'll open it up for questions. Okay, great. So HTML specifically renders. It's just an HTML file with a script attached to it. Inside of HTML, there is a division with the ID of root. Inside of that division of ID of root, we know that main.jsx is going to render app.jsx because it has a document.get element by ID root. Right, so it grabs the root division and it says, hey, I want you to show all of the context inside of main.js, of app.jsx. Now, app.jsx has a bunch of JavaScript code, but what it's actually returning is just the HTML document that we have down below. Right, so this returns a form with a button and a good old image container. Now, when I click on this button or I submit my form, my handle submit event gets triggered. The event gets passed into the onSubmit function. That then gets a prevent default, which prevents the entire web page from being able to replicate. And let me just put Gitto in there for demonstrational purposes, right? We then grab the input field itself. So the input field, we grab it. We grabbed Ditto out of the input field by grabbing it by its value attribute. We then utilize Axios to send a request. Well, that portion looks something like this. We have Axios.get, which sends a request to an outside entity, which in this case, it's the Pokey API. The Pokey API receives request, formulates response, and returns a response. We make these a little curved so that we can see how that works. All right. So now the response comes back. We grab the data attribute out of our response. And from there, we return data.sprites.frontDefault. That goes into the create image tag, which creates an image, adds our class name into it, and then appends the image into our HTML document with Ditto inside of it. All right. And that is going to cover the entire functionality for our application. That's how React connects to a browser. The browser sends a request. The server sends back the HTML document. That HTML document hooks up to main.jsx, which renders the app.jsx. App.jsx executes the code that we have above on the onSubmit button, which grabs information, returns it, and then renders an image inside of our image container. All right. At this point, does anyone have any questions over everything that we covered today? Let's hear it, Demi.
Just a quick question. So when all this information, everything is going on with React and stuff, for the client side, do they see any of this JavaScript, or is it just populating as HTML only?
That's a great question. And on the client side, anything that's front end, so all of your JavaScript code will always be exposed to the client. Let me see. I don't think it's in here. Might be in, nope, not in performance. Here we go. So here we have index.html. We can see it running. It has my has my viewport. If I go into React, it has a ridiculous amount of information, but if I scrub through all of this, eventually I'll find my actual JavaScript code where I wrote my functions, how to fetch them, and how to capture all this information. It's all very much exposed here for the client to take a look.
Okay, yeah, that answered it. And then the second question on that TL draw, just for like I guess visual purposes, if we had a home.jsx and about.jsx, you would basically have like three small boxes doing the exact same thing inside the main.jsx to render.
Yes, we're going to be covering that later on once we act into the React router. So I don't want to draw it out and try to explain it now. But short answer is yes.
Okay. All right. That was confirming. Thank you.
Gary?
Just a little ahead, but what is the React DOM.render function? Is this just pretty much what it's doing in the background?
Yes, so the React
Gotcha.
render is just saying, hey, I want you to insert all of the Java JSX return statements that are rendering HTML, and I want you to do HTML injection and put it on inside of the HTML document.
Gotcha. Thank you.
All right, no other questions. Okay, fantastic. If there aren't any other questions, I'm going to go ahead and stop our recording.